Oh, well, thank you so much. Everybody can hear me okay? And out there in Zoom land, it is fantastic for me to be here because my grandparents lived just down the street. Before the major, freeway going through here, Atwater was a normal street. And I remember going there as a kid, small kid, visiting my grandparents who lived in a second floor flat there on Atwater. So I feel a really strong connection to this place. Now I'm going to try and load this up. I think I've got it mastered. Let's just see if I can make it happen. I've got people watching me carefully. In case I go wrong, share this. I'm going to go over here. Whoop. I think, how am I doing so far? One more. Let's see now. Whoop. Hey, I do deserve a round of applause for that. This is this may be the most challenging thing I do today. So yeah, how history can light up the future is the subject of my talk. I'm going to talk about two books, one of which is published, and I've already shown you, but it was just a fleeting glance. This is the one, you all signed a paper coming in saying that you were going to go out and buy this after the talk. So I've got that in writing. The other, I'm going to talk briefly as well as my work in progress, which is tentatively entitled American Invasions and the Ghosts of Montreal. But when you start talking to publishers and agents, believe it or not, they do not bow down and say to the author, oh, that's wonderful, that's perfect. They often push back. And they say, we might have to change that. So, tentative title, that's okay. In the beginning, I'll just go back very briefly to how I got here to this. Yeah, I have worked with ghosts before. My first novel was called Kerouac's Ghost. When I went on the road from the town in which I grew up, which was Saint-Martin-le-Lac, entre Oka et Deux-Montagnes, right on the lake there. And I also shared with Kerouac French-Canadian heritage. In fact, the truth of the matter is, he and I both have Peltier ancestors that arrived here in 1641. That's probably my greatest claim to fame. Then my first nonfiction book, that was my first novel. My first nonfiction book was Canada's Undeclared War, Fighting Words from the Literary Trenches. So I've been, broadcasting my political opinions for quite a long time. I worked as a journalist. I worked at the Toronto Star, the Montreal Star, and the Calgary Herald. Funnily enough, my late wife Sheena and I were back here in Montreal after a lot of traveling. We'd been over in Africa. We felt the need to come home there in the mid-'70s. when things were going awry. And I got on at the Montreal Star, and I was there when it went down. Some of you may remember that, 1979. At that time, I was the only breadwinner. Most of the time I wasn't. We both were. But we had a baby, my son, who is now in his mid-40s. So I had to go and find a job somewhere else, which is why I ended up leaving Montreal, which is probably not an unfamiliar story. But I did end up, well, basically sailing through history, an adventure in exploration. You see, that's what I was chasing Kerouac on the road. That was a kind of exploration. He was really an explorer, an on-the-road adventurous type, and I got into that, and that took me eventually, up to the Arctic for 6 books. But really, we're talking about Canadian history in one way or another, and that surfaced as well in the 3 books I wrote with a Celtic base to them, Scottish, Irish. You can see the titles there. And yeah, so we had a lot of fun because I take a creative nonfiction approach to history, a theme to which I will return. And that means going, what means for me anyway, going where events happened. So it's not just sitting in the archive, although God knows I've done a lot of that. It's going where things happen to see for myself what things look like. As for this new book, Shadows of Tyranny, this particular story, it begins with a munitions factory on the edge of town. So, you know, the allegorical position anyway is that you're out walking your dog at 4 a.m. and you look over and you see the munitions factory, which has been there a long time. The front office is on fire, and you realize, well, if this thing blows up, it's going to blow our whole town to smithereens. So that's basically what I see happening with regard to what's going on in the U.S. right now. Let me see if I can give you a quick paragraph here. This goes back to, well, in the autumn of 2016, a wealthy American woman told me during a private conversation at a public event in Toronto that she was surprised to see Canadians taking such an interest in the U.S. presidential election. We couldn't vote, after all, and presidents come and go every 4 years. Why would Canadians concern themselves? I had expressed a worry that Donald Trump might get elected, and she was indicating that, as a Canadian, I should keep my opinions to myself. I observed mildly that whatever happened in the U.S. affected the whole world, and especially Canada, but then I let the matter drop. Canadian politesse, eh? Yeah, so I let it drop for a while anyway. I've been forced to return to that subject by what Leonard might have called our current predicament. The theme running through these works, history does not repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes, attributed to many people, notably Mark Twain. And there's a lot of truth to that. And that's what I ended up exploring in Shadows of Tyranny, because here you have Donald Trump consorting with Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and a myriad of other authoritarian figures. What, me worry? So while I was doing the research on the straightforward history, I also got involved in reading visionary writers who made more general observations about the rise of authoritarianism and what it means. Margaret Atwood, her marvelous novel, The Handmaid's Tale. Actually, I ended up interviewing her in 1985 when that book first appeared, and I remembered raving about it. I quote her here in the book. And she, of course, pointed to George Orwell. I should tell you, if you get a chance to see this new movie called Orwell, 2 + 2 = 5, it's really strange, but it's definitely worth checking out. Surprise, surprise, Donald Trump makes an appearance. Yeah, keep going on the visionary writers. You get to, soon enough, Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here, which was a novel that he published in 1935. That was really early. And of course, what he demonstrates is, okay, look, folks, it can happen here, which was the lesson. More visionary writers. Okay, one of the biggest surprises for me was Jack London. We all know Jack London, White Fang, Call of the Wild. We don't think of London as having a political dimension, but he was far left. And this book, The Iron Heel, is incredibly prescient with regard to what's been happening here, like the 2021 assault on the Capitol building in the States. He's got something exactly like that going on in The Iron Heel. So that was instructive. Go back right to the early days, the War of the Worlds. People think, oh, that's fantasy fiction. But if you really look at it, what it is, it's an alien power, overwhelming force invading your country. And suddenly it begins to take on a present-day significance. This book, a novel by Yevgeny Zamyatin, Atwood was the one who brought that forward as well, because she realized, whoa, this book was out before 1984 and strongly influenced Orwell. Orwell's book is better literarily, but Zamyatin was right on the money. And he ended up leaving Stalin's Russia to survive for a while longer in Paris. But that's a very, very prescient novel. And then a little bit of a shift, Philip Roth, the plot against America. It's an alternative history. An election during the American election during the Second World War. And lo and behold, the bad guys win. And he draws on his personal past. And so young Philip, at this time, his mother tells Philip, well, you're not going to school today. He says, well, why am I not going to school today? And she says, well, we might be going to war with Canada. War with Canada? You can't figure that out. Well, of course, it's because Canada is already part of the war on the side of Britain, and the Americans look like they're going in on the side of the Nazis. So, he identified that strain in the American public back then. So I write about all these books in the course of telling the story here. So history rhyming, what happened last time during the first age of dictatorship? I call it the first age. Of course, dictatorships go back forever. But during the 1930s in particular, well, you had Hitler looking on at Mussolini early days and seeing, oh yeah, he marches on the government, and he marches on Rome in that case, and he ends up taking power. That looks like a model to emulate. And subsequently they're very good friends. I'll return to Hitler before this is over. Meanwhile, you got Franco in Spain. So they've got a democratic elected government in Spain. And Franco, general, he decides, well, among any number of others, I think we should be in charge. And so he launches a civil war and, to overthrow the government, which in the end he does make happen. And then you've got Stalin in Russia. So I have a hard time, I'm not sure which of those dictators was worse. Was it Hitler or was it Stalin? They were both murderous, unbelievably awful individuals. Without going into any details at this point. So then the question for me became, well, what happens when a mighty nation empowers a fascist demagogue? In other words, well, first of all, how did Hitler rise to power? Well, it was gradual. Initially, emulating Mussolini, he mounted a march in Munich. But they put that down, and they actually had a trial and put him in jail, although it was quite a fancy jail he was in. He was having visitors and playing Wagner on his recorder. But the interesting thing was his trial gave him this big platform. So he was able to get up there in his own defense and rant and rave. And a lot of people, MAGA types, were saying, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What happened during the First World War? He never accepted, as many didn't, that the Germans had been defeated. They'd been stabbed in the back. And who did the stabbing? Well, the Jews did the stabbing. That was what happened. He identified his target scapegoats right then and there. And then, so he ran in elections, and he increased his party, Nazi party status. And then the parliament buildings, the Reichstag, they clandestinely set that ablaze, arson, and they found someone to blame, a poor, dumb immigrant, and they killed him. But we're able to use the burning of the Reichstag as an excuse. Oh, emergency measures, and that means we can do anything we damn well please. So that's what started. Meanwhile, of course, you've got in Spain, you've got what evolved very quickly into the Spanish Civil War. Franco leading his rebellion against this democratically elected government. And you think, well, the government's going to win this. 1,700 Canadians were involved in that resistance, which failed. Franco carried the day. The last of the Canadians were, they weren't airlifted, they were taken out by ship. People like Norman Bethune, I wandered past his statue here not too far away, not long ago. What an incredible man he was. He was there in Spain. As soon as he heard this was going on, and he wasn't the only one, he went over there. He built a blood transfusion service. He was an extraordinary figure, and I tell that story in the book. So Hitler's rising. What happened? Didn't anyone sound the alarm? Well, actually, they did. I think my favorite alarm sounder was Matthew Halton, father of David Halton. Some of you may remember as a CBC broadcaster. Matthew Halton was a kid from Pincher Creek, Alberta. And he got himself an education with the help essentially of his mother, really. And he ended up in London as a foreign correspondent for the Toronto Star. Now, during that period, 1930s, he sees what's going on in Germany. He's been there, traveling around, for pleasure. And then he decides, well, I better go back again because things seem to be escalating. And he goes back and he writes a 10-part series for the Toronto Star that really lays it out. And Hitler's, going mad. Most people said, extreme, what does he know? Dorothy Thompson, a still more famous American journalist, she learned German, spent time in Germany. She was the one who inspired Sinclair Lewis to write that novel, It Can't Happen Here. She married him. And he said later, because she would talk. And he said later, well, if ever there's a divorce, I'm going to name Hitler as a correspondent, because she was on his case, and Lewis had the chops to write a novel, which is what he did. And she reached a lot of people in the States. She was a leading figure in the resistance, in the American resistance. But they were already polarized with regard to how to respond to this. Winston Churchill was undoubtedly the greatest resistance leader. He had been basically a pacifist. Okay, we don't need to worry about rearming through the 20s and so forth. He ended up as a backbencher, and then he began getting information about what was happening, what Germany was doing, and he began talking about it. And indeed, warning loudly, hey, Hitler poses a threat. That's Churchill, he's just talking, right? Today we have American thinkers. These are just three: Anne Applebaum, Robert Kagan, Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Think of Heather Cox Richardson, Robert Reich, Rachel Maddow. All kinds of leading Americans are warning against what's happening in the States. They're fighting the fire that I cited in the beginning. Of course, just because you're fighting, that doesn't mean you're going to be able to put the fire out. I think of two individuals. Well, there's Neville Chamberlain waving his famous piece of paper. He goes to this meeting in Munich, and he signs a deal with Hitler. Okay, Hitler, you can take the Sudetenland, that part of Czechoslovakia, and for the rest, everything's status quo. Peace in our time. He comes back. That's what he's telling his people, right? And but our Canadian Prime Minister, and this is a real puzzler. Mackenzie King, William Lyon Mackenzie King, was well educated. He was a smart guy. He knew how to negotiate, but he had this problem. He had a weird relationship with his dead mother, and so he was consulting spirits and so forth. And he was in London at a meeting, and he got talking with von Ribbentrop, one of Hitler's men. And what happened was Churchill wandered over, and the German and the Englishman kind of looked at each other. They didn't like each other. Churchill tried to give Mackenzie King the high sign, but he wanted to talk to von Ribbentrop. Churchill wandered off. Von Ribbentrop invited him to Berlin. Yeah, you can meet Hitler. See for yourself. So Mackenzie King goes to Berlin. He's ferried around here and there, and finally he gets to meet the great man, and he realizes, Hitler has a real relationship with his mother. And he later writes in his diary, Hitler, he's a man of peace. He reminds me of Joan of Arc. That's our Canadian Prime Minister of the time. Pretty scary. Because, June 1940, Germany occupied France. So the French had the Maginot Line. This was going to protect them. The Maginot Line extended into what was called the Ardennes Forest. And there was no possibility, nobody could get through the Ardennes Forest except, look at this blitzkrieg tactic. Tanks slamming through the Ardennes Forest. Boom. Suddenly, Hitler and the Nazis are controlling Paris. They take over France. So again, there's that same image of taken from the War of the Worlds. That's your overwhelming force living next door that suddenly occupies and takes control of your country. Think about that for a minute. So Hitler had his targeted scapegoats. In his case, the scapegoats were European Jews. He wanted to eradicate all of Europe of anybody with Jewish blood. So you had, obviously, people standing up and arguing and saying, this is ridiculous, and worse. Hannah Arendt, fantastic intellectual, and she managed to escape. And you had Walter Benjamin, another extraordinary genius. He tried to escape using the same route. He didn't make it. He died trying to exit from France. So you can understand, well, why the Nazis would be after them, because they were outspoken, articulate, and so dangerous intellectuals. Irene Nemirovsky, brilliant novelist, widely recognized, celebrated throughout France. She'd lived in France for many years, and she did everything she could to blend in, saying, well, you know, I'm really a bourgeoise. I've taken my children and converted them to Catholicism, and I myself am a Catholic convert. I'm really French, you know. The Nazis looked at this, and they found her, she was guilty of being Jewish. So sent her to the concentration camp. Boom. That was the end of her. Oh, and get rid of her husband too while we're at it. That's how it went there. So there was a polarization among the French. You had one side, the anti-Semitic collaborators who saw, well, maybe there's something in this for me. Yeah, and there were a lot of, when I looked into it, there were a lot of different degrees of anti-Semitism, it seemed to me. You had, you know, Bertrand de Jouvenel. He was more of a philosopher, a thinker, and he was trying to sort out where he stood. He actually had a relationship for a couple of years with Martha Gellhorn, another great journalist. And he, at the end of the war, he managed to recant and sort it out, and he moved considerably to the left. But then you had people like Louis Ferdinand Céline. There's something visceral, a certain racism that is so deeply ingrained that there's no overcoming it. And you had Ezra Pound, who also had a deeply ingrained anti-Semitism, but he was exploiting it. We all know Pound, 1920s. He was a poet, great poet, and a friend of Hemingway and Joyce, and things were wonderful in Paris in the 20s. You get into the 30s, and Pound moves to Italy, and he starts doing radio broadcasts, anti-Semitic radio broadcasts, and Mussolini's funding him money. These things are fantastic. He's broadcasting it out. You know, and you can think of parallels. You know, people who just sell out to the powers that be. Fortunately, you had the other side. You had the resistors, and the French resistance was extraordinary. Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, Lucie Aubrac, André Malraux. Malraux was France's answer to Hemingway, kind of an adventurous novelist. He fought first in the Spanish Civil War. And but Lucie Aubrac, I think, is my favorite resistance fighter. She and her husband were a part of a small group down in southern France that were, you know, blowing up Nazi train stations and things like that. And what's amazing about her is she rescued her husband, not once, not twice, but 3 times after he was taken by the Gestapo. Extraordinary. She was smart, and she again and again outwitted the people who were holding her husband. Oh, I've got to get in. He's sick. He needs these pills. You know, I'm pregnant now, and we have to marry, so you have to let him come with me. And then that convoy is ambushed and wiped out. Heck of a good story there. So, the resistors. Churchill came to office just in time, and one of the first things he did was enlist a couple of Canadians into major key positions. Max Aiken, Lord Beaverbrook. He was the guy that really built the British Air Force that managed to stave off the attacks by the Luftwaffe. And he did things like, okay, the Americans had this Lend-Lease arrangement because they didn't want to admit they were assisting. So they would send planes, they would fly planes up to Newfoundland. And then they would dismantle them and float them across the Atlantic to England, where they would rebuild them. And Beaverbrook took one look at this and said, "Are you crazy?" He brought in some bush pilots from the north, and they took those planes and flew them to England. It was fairly, common sense. Talk about it. William Stevenson created a network throughout the States comprising mostly Canadian women to handle publicity and propaganda, fighting on the side of democracy, because there was this other side going on. There's actually a wonderful, you can actually track down Dorothy Thompson interrupting one of these Nazi rallies in New York City. Anyway, there we are. So we had foreign agents in there as well. Vera Atkins, Odette Sanson, Sonia d'Artois. Sonia married Guy d'Artois, and they moved to Hudson, which happens to be where my wife grew up. So I knew Hudson quite well, and she knew she knew their kids. Sonia was, one of those women who flew in to Germany and pretended, well, I'm just an innocent French girl. So, but one of the most amazing was Josephine Baker. She was already a celebrated danseuse and chanteuse in France. She'd struggled in the States despite her extraordinary talent. Oh, she's a black woman, we can't really fat her properly. In Paris, they took to her, they loved her. And she began touring all over the world. So they weren't sure then, the underground, she was so wealthy, whether she would, volunteer to assist the resistance. They sent a guy out to see, and she said yes, because France has been so good to me that I will do anything I can in this struggle. And so I tell all these stories in my book. Meanwhile, there were Canadians putting their lives on the line. Tommy Prince, an Indigenous fighter, some extraordinary stories about how he would ambush German Nazi machine guns and so forth. And Farley Mowat, we all know Farley, all kinds of different books, maybe mainly the North and wildlife, but he wrote 2 books about the war. He wrote a regimental history and an extraordinary memoir, And No Birds Sang. And if you want to see what it was really like, he made it vivid. Fortunately, Hitler was a liar and a cheater, and fortunate in this way only, that he made a deal with Stalin early on. Okay, look, Stalin, look. You take Eastern Poland, I'll take Western Poland, and you and I will leave each other alone. Stalin looked that over. He was dubious, but yeah, that sounds reasonable to me. So Hitler concentrated down on Western Europe. But when he he was going to take over the world, hubris is one of the things that really marks these autocrats. I mean, have you ever seen anything more hubristic than knocking down the East Wing of the White House? Okay, Trump thinks it's George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and me. Okay, I'll get back to that. Hitler betrays Stalin. Just shows again, the paper, that he signs, that doesn't mean anything to him. He betrays Stalin, invades Russia. If you'd known a little more history, Napoleon, he maybe wouldn't have done that, but he did it, and Stalin retaliated, and so many people, so much land, so much winter. Ultimately, Hitler was basically on his back heel. He couldn't believe it. Meanwhile, you've got the USA drawn in by Pearl Harbor, drawn into the war. Okay, then suddenly they knew what side they were on, and they also went into the European area. And already, the U.S. was had such a powerful economy. So as soon as they turned it to war, you had an overwhelming force joining the war. The Allies, as we all know, were victorious. And Toronto, for example, was celebrating in May 1945. I mean, the whole of the Western world at that point was celebrating that victory. And there was a certain amount of backsliding, and this was interesting to me as well. I touch on this briefly. The Cold War between the U.S. and Russia really spawns Roy Cohn, who was a key advisor to Joe McCarthy and his witch hunt. Hunting down anybody that he thought were enemies. Maybe they had some kind of communist ties, and they deserved to be persecuted and driven from their jobs and so forth. Roy Cohn was the man who orchestrated that, and lo and behold, Roy Cohn became a key advisor to Donald Trump early on. It was Cohn that taught Trump, okay, don't worry about lying. The bigger the lie, the better. You never made a mistake. Do not admit to having made a mistake. You never made a mistake. You were always right. All these things, and I really enjoyed, after writing about this, seeing a movie called The Apprentice, which came out not long ago, that focuses exclusively, well, not exclusively, but mostly on the relationship between Roy Cohn and Trump, young Trump. So later, after Cohn died, Trump was going around, he was in trouble. Where's my Roy Cohn? Cohn was the man who taught him how to misbehave. So the rhyming of history, I don't know, hapless leaders step aside too late, maybe. Actually, Neville Chamberlain made it just in time. Maybe Joe Biden left it a little too long. I was going to call this book initially Awakening to Invasion, a resistance narrative ranging from Hitler and Stalin to Donald J. Trump. So this is the kind of thing that happens with titles. Okay, so maybe this was a bit overblown, I admit that. And we toned it down a bit to Shadows of Tyranny, but this was this was the undercurrent of the book. And I was still thinking, so after Trump was elected a second time, when exactly are we rhyming? If we're rhyming, I have a timeline in the book, looking, 1932, 1934, what was going on. Because you got Trump echoing Hitler on the campaign trail. I'll get rid of the communists and vermin. I'll take care of the threat from within. Migrants are poisoning the blood of our country. One people, one family, one glorious nation. It all comes straight from Mein Kampf. So I'm looking at the timeline. It was more extreme then. June 30th, 1934, that was the night of the long knives. It was actually a couple of nights, but Hitler had all his rivals killed. Anybody that represented even a sympathetic threat, Hitler just had them eradicated. Boom. Go out and kill those guys. And that's what they did. August the 2nd, Hindenburg dies, former president who'd been wondering, he was well into his 80s and thinking, I'm not sure this is right. Hitler became the all-powerful Führer. I think that's where we're heading, because soon enough, the armed forces were swearing an oath not to the German Constitution, but to Hitler personally. Now, does that resonate with what's been going on? So you don't even have to take, obviously, some obscure Canadian writer. You don't have to take my word for it. You got Trump's top general on Trump himself. No one has ever been as dangerous to this country. He is a fascist to the core. The chancellor becomes the all-powerful Fuhrer in 1934. How close is Trump to being the all-powerful Fuhrer? I just asked that question. In the epilogue to the book, I ask, where is our Churchill? Because I'm beginning to think, whoa, maybe we need someone extraordinary to combat this situation. And subsequent thought, our Churchill may be a whole nation. I think each of us is going to have to end up choosing collaboration or resistance. I wonder, before we see an invasion, I think of France in relation to Germany. I think actually we might see a civil war in the States. Anyway, provisional titles on my work in progress, which is an extension of Shadows of Tyranny. So Shadows has to be read first. The main body, I'm looking at 5 chapters covering the history from 1775, well, mostly to the present day. Each begins and ends with me talking to the ghost of a historical figure, Benjamin Franklin, Guy Carleton. They were both here down the street at the Chateau Ramsay on Notre Dame. Thomas D'Arcy McGee, assassinated in 1968. He was living on St. Catherine Street. He was assassinated in Ottawa. He was living on St. Catherine Street at around 1198 St. Catherine. And I had my great-great-grandparents living just 2 blocks away at 1359. They had a grocery store there. So I'm feeling this personally. I'm taking it personally. As for dealing with ghosts, well, precedents for this exist in nonfiction books. I think of Lyndon McIntyre's wonderful book, The Wake, which tells the story of a Newfoundland tsunami that left a deadly legacy, and he has conversations with the dead. And I think of Mark Abley. I'm sure most of you know his work. He wrote an entire book, Conversations with a Dead Man. So it's been done before. And this approach is in a way my response to the fact that history is on the ropes, especially Canadian history. But what am I going to do about it? I don't run a university. I don't set a provincial curriculum. All I can do is, the way I write history, try to reach a broad general audience. So that's what I'm going on about. These 2 books are part of my campaign. Let's make history exciting again so that people read it. The traditional approach to history pretends to objectivity, rejects the pronoun I and any allusion to personal experience. I take an exactly opposite position. It maintains a single point of view. No, it's strictly chronological. But for me, it's time to break free from that. A creative nonfiction approach can get people reading history, I hope. That's what I think. Because I think history, looking back at what happened, speaks to and throws a lot of light on the way into the future. So, is that exciting or what? That's what I've got to say. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.